So today we are talking about grids. So grids are the background for all origami tessellations. I suppose you could free fold some stuff, but for the most part, we are folding our tessellations on background grids. And there's a lot of questions that come up when we're putting these background grid lines in place. I've gathered some in advance, and I'm also hoping that y'all will put more questions in the chat so I can go through and answer your pressing questions about grids, clear things up so that you can have fun folding this Advent of Tess. Good morning, Nancy. Glad to have you with us. So one of the questions I got in advance is about folding on slightly imperfect shapes. So you might have a homemade hexagon template that is ever so slightly off. You might have a laser cut acrylic template like the ones that I sell at gatheringfolds.com and have some instability in your cutting surface, some wobble in your blade, and still get an imperfect hexagon. And I actually went through this myself. I had one template that came with a defect. Thankfully it was marked and it didn't go out to anyone else. But I had cut a stack of like 50 sheets of hexagons with this imperfect template. And so I figured out some really solid ways to get a good grid even with an imperfect hexagon. And I went ahead and cut another hexagon with that imperfect template this morning. And I guess we'll all find out. Yeah, already on this first fold, I'm seeing that one edge of this hexagon is longer than the others. If I zoom really far in here, you can see on this corner, those layers are not quite matching up. And on this corner, they are also not quite matching up. It's less obvious on this side, less of a difference. They're also not quite matching up. And the bottom layer is wider. When I fold straight through, wow, that is really off. I do not like this direction as the starting direction. So the first thing I'm going to do is try and find some direction on the paper where I can have a reasonable match between the different sides. This one, I go to match it up and the top layer is longer. This direction, I can match it up, but it's okay. I can match it exactly at one corner. Sorry, my head was in the way there. I can match it exactly at one corner and it's off on the other corner. So this is probably what was wrong with the template. That one edge was just shifted further out, but we don't actually know. And so I'm going to start with this direction. And I'm going to assume that this edge is bad. I'm going to actually mark that for us, so we can have fold number 1. And the long side. And let's see. So I'm going to go back to my original fold. So what I want to avoid for now is using that bad side that I've designated as a reference at all. And so I'll bring the other side of the paper up and fold through. And this one, like I mentioned before, isn't super happy on either side. And it's kind of even actually. So it's not just a matter of one's edge is too far out. There's bigger problems with this hexagon. I'm not exactly sure what. But this will be our direction number 2. So I'll rotate here and put primary line 2. And then, oh, and I'll also reverse each of these new folds just to be consistent with how I fold everything else. And now I have this edge that I suspect is past the corners of the true hexagon. I'm going to have that up top while I fold the 3rd direction. And this one, I'm really focusing on lining up the folds of the first 2 directions on the top and bottom layers. So so zoom in here. I'm not bringing the edges of the paper together. I'm focusing on getting a clean intersection where these 3 sets of grid lines come together. And that actually gives me a cleaner fold. Again, not perfectly clean, but cleaner fold to the corners of this hexagon. And that is my direction number 3. And I'll reverse that crease. Now let's say I'm doing this grid to 32 divisions. Keep it nice and easy, a standard grid division. What I'm going to do is be very intentional about every single time I add a new set of divisions. I'm going to do direction 1, then direction 2, then direction 3, because I specifically chose direction 3 as the least precise one. So I want to have the most folded references by the time I get there. So in direction 1, I can pretty much trust the edges of the paper, which is good because you have to trust the edges for your first new division of a first direction of a new division. So I can fold the quarters on that. And even here, there's a slight question of, do I trust the edges or do I trust where this fold to the corner hits the edge of the paper, which is a slightly different location? I'm going to go with the edges for this direction. Emphasis for this direction. And, oh good, I'm glad this is useful for you. And then direction 2, and good morning, Zach, good morning, Erlu. Glad y'all could join us. Direction 2, I now have grid lines that I can pair up on the top and bottom flaps at all 3 of these grid intersections. So there's grid lines through there. The grid line here is meeting a grid line in a different direction, but it has to meet at the intersection. And then here I have a grid line that goes through in this direction and the specific center intersection that I'm meeting. And then from the other side, I still have those same grid lines to match up. And when I can't get everything to exactly perfectly line up, I'm going to average. So if, for example, I can't get this grid line to exactly match with this one up here and this grid line to exactly match with this one up here, I'm kind of averaging between the two to get it as close as possible for both of them at the same time. And then flip over and reverse those creases. Now for direction 3, when and this is my overshoot edge, when I bring that overshoot edge up, I am intentionally not aligning the edge of the paper with the center crease. I'm actually overshooting. So you can see my center grid line here, and I've overshot the edge, I don't know, a millimeter or so, because that is how the grid lines are lining up on either side. And so there will actually be grid lines on this edge crossing just before you get to the edge of the paper. And that's something that we can expect on an imperfect hexagon. And rest crease. And on the other side, often an overshoot edge is paired with an undershoot edge. This time it's coming pretty precisely to the center, but that is the variable to play with. Oh, sorry, my head was in the way. That is the variable to play with here, is like, how far is this going to get all of these grid lines on the different layers to line up again? And then, like I mentioned before, you do not want to start a new set of divisions with direction 3. You want to always start that with direction 1. So if it helps to mark out 1, 2, 3 on your grid, definitely do that. For me personally, the way I flip the paper over is so consistent every time that I just do my rotation to the next direction each time I flip, instead of staying in the same orientation when I've finished the third direction of a set of divisions. So I'll do one more round, then use some light to show the precision of these grid intersections. And whenever possible, I'm using the inner grid lines as references instead of the edges of the paper. So the bottom line with the imperfect hexagons is you try out all the directions, you see which one is the most perfect, and then you treat that direction as the only direction with perfect edges. You always start the next round of divisions in that direction. And that will be kind of the source of truth for the rest of the folding. And then starting with the second direction, you can line up grid lines on the top and bottom flaps. You can't do that in the first direction because when you fold that first direction, there are no grid intersections in the bottom flap in the same places as the grid intersections on the top flap, which is annoying a little. But by picking one direction to be the reference direction, you can get away with using less than perfect hexagons. So another question that I got was, what do you do if you have an imperfect square? And that's, I'm going to say, a little bit more of a challenge if you want to fold a square grid, because the square grid doesn't have more error correction mechanisms than just, is this line perpendicular to that line? We don't have these converging lines that let us gauge the distance that we should be folding at. So in the square grid, if we do want to have more references, if we think it's an imperfect square, like if we do the diagonals and the diagonal doesn't line up the edges of the paper while hitting the corner, both corners, then you're dealing with an imperfect square, and it might be better to fold a 45-degree grid, so a square grid with diagonals on that sheet, so that you can get the error correction. And that's something where I would actually start with the diagonals if I wanted to be most precise. Well, either the horizontal and vertical halves or the diagonals. And then use the one set of lines to determine the other and make sure that center intersection is really good. And then you can use those to move forward. And this is why I say always reference your grid to the other parts of the grid. Ignore the edge of the paper as much as possible. So, wow, those are picture perfect grid intersections, even close to the edge there. So imperfect hexagons are indeed recoverable, and you can still fold tessellations on them. You're just not necessarily going to have grid lines coming exactly to the edge. You're not necessarily going to have perfect grid intersections right at the edge of the paper. Like these three are all grid lines crossing before they meet the edge. Sorry, that's right on the light there, so it's hard to see. But this line you can definitely see is not hitting the edge of the paper. Likewise, this line on the far side, and the line of grid intersections is actually straight between those 2 points. So it is indeed possible to still fold a perfect grid on an imperfect hexagon. The next question that I have stored up is, how small do you fold your grid? And I'm going to break this into at different stages of your tessellation folding skill levels and for different types of paper. So when you first start folding tessellations, if you have a hexagon that's about hand-sized, so 3 inches per edge, you might only be comfortable folding 8 divisions and doing this little hexagon puff that I've taught a couple places in the last month. But over time, you can work up to folding even 32 grid divisions on that same size of paper. And so there's not one answer for my size of paper is this, how many grid divisions? For some people, 16 is too many on this size. For me, I could maybe even go a little smaller than 32. It all depends on what other paper I have available. So for example, I would recommend up to 16 on this size for beginners. For a 5-inch sheet of paper, so 5 inches per side, this is what a 24 division grid looks like. It's slightly narrower than my pinky finger, and that is the reference that I would use for beginners. So pull out one of the grids that I had showing earlier. This is a 12.5-inch square, and I've folded 32 grid divisions on it, and it is also slightly narrower than my pinky finger. And that is the gold standard for beginners. And so whatever size of paper you have, you might have to do a little bit of experimentation to find out how many divisions is that size on your sheet of paper. But for a hexagon with 5 inches per edge, 24 divisions is good. With 7 inches per edge, so these are my small and large acrylic templates, with 7 inches per edge, 32 divisions is good for beginners. For 12.5 inches square, which would be ballpark 32 centimeters, I do 32 divisions of square grid for beginners. But then there's folding for more advanced folders. And I would say for more advanced folders, approximately double what the number of divisions as I would recommend for a beginner. So for these mini hexagons, I go up to 32. For the moderate size hexagons, these small hexagons, I go up to 48. For the larger hexagons, I go up to 64. And likewise for these larger squares, I go up to 64. And if I want to fold more than 64 divisions, then I use a larger sheet of paper. I have bigger hexagons, so I have extra large hexagons, and then I have triple X large hexagons for the massive pieces. And that is what we're looking at with these standard grids. Now with the rotated grids, it gets a little bit trickier, because in the hexagons, when you fold a rotated grid, a grid where the lines are not aligned with the edge of the paper, then your divisions, aka the space between parallel grid lines, gets smaller for the same number of grid divisions. And that will feed into another question that we have. How do you count on rotated grids? So that's something to be careful about. This kind of grid that I'm folding, where the grid lines are perpendicular to the edge, makes the smallest spaces between parallel grid lines. So I did the math once, and this perpendicular direction, the distance between parallel grid lines, is about the same as if you did 72 division. So for 64 divisions, perpendicular is about the same as 72 divisions parallel to the edge. So there's some wiggle room in there. With the square grids, it's actually the opposite. The standard orientation has the grid lines closest together, and as you rotate, they become further apart. That's because when you're counting on rotated grids, you are counting on the grid line through the center. And on a standard grid, on a hexagon, I'll zoom out here. On a standard grid on a hexagon, the grid line through the center goes the longest possible distance through the hexagon, from corner to opposite corner. On a perpendicular grid, that grid line goes the shortest possible distance on a hexagon, from side to opposite side, straight across. And so when we're counting 64 divisions on here, and counting 64 divisions on here, the distance between successive divisions has to be different, because these lines are covering different amounts of distance. Another way to think about it is that these rotated grids are basically standard grids with extra stuff on the corners. So if we take, so these marked points are where the center lines of the rotated grid are hitting the edge of the paper. And if I fold in the corners, well, now those center lines are going from corner to corner of a hexagon, and we've got a standard grid in the middle that is how we count our number of grid divisions on this line from corner to opposite corner. It just so happens that those corners have been placed inside of a bigger hexagon at some angle. So we really ignore the outer corners when it comes to counting on a rotated grid. It's all about how many divisions are on this line through the center from side to opposite side. And let's see, what's up next? So the other question I got is on folding fifths without getting stray lines. So I'm going to actually take my medium hexagon here and demonstrate that. So the key thing with folding odd divisions is that you need to keep track of the previous division and the future division, and then make sure that you're only adding lines that belong in the next division. So for folding fifths, we're actually going to start by folding fourths, quarters. So I'll do this aligned on this grid. I'm going to start by folding in half and then bringing the edges into the center. I need all of these folds in order to get my reference points on here. I could do this on a square as well and go directly to folding fifths, but this is the context that's the most confusing, and this is the context that I'm pretty sure the person asking was talking about. And actually, y'all can clarify in the comments if you want to see fifths in general or fifths on a bigger grid. And I'll do those quarter lines in all three directions. This is a good hexagon, so I don't need to worry so much about the corners or about trying to adjust things to make the grid work out. And I'm happy to talk about thirds, sevenths, any other gridding questions. It doesn't have to be Advent of Tess specific. And okay, so I've got my quarters in all three directions, and it's time to put in the pinch marks for referencing the fifths. I'm going to choose this target trapezoid that has 2 spaces on one side and 3 on the other. And I'll fold the diagonals for that from the harsher grid line side of the paper, the side that was mountain folds before I reversed everything. And I'll set up first one diagonal, and I'm lining up the corners of the diagonal, but I'm careful to pinch only in the center triangle. So I can look at my edge with 1, 2, 3 spaces, really my edge with an odd number of spaces, and say, okay, the middle of those is the center triangle, I'm going to pinch in there, and then in the opposite direction, lining up my corners and then pinching just over that intersection. So now I have an intersection that is 2/5 away from the center line and 3/5 away from that next grid line. Well, 2/5, that's kind of skinny. It's going to be tough to keep parallel to the next fold over. So I'd rather work from the other side and add in these 5/5 of this last spacing relative to the edge. So, or next to the edge. So this point where I have a grid intersection is 5 plus 3, 8 new divisions away from my reference pinch intersection. So I can bring that point, and this is a point-to-point reference, up to my pinches and fold through. And at this point, I'm keeping track in my mind. Okay, that was 8. That means this bottom half is 4. I can fold 4 in half, which means that this bottom half is 2. I can fold 2 in half. And then I have 3 out of the 4 new lines in this chunk of space. And I can rotate around, pick up this old grid line as a mountain and say, okay, I want to put a line 2/5 up. So I'm going to go and fold to the 4/5 line, because 4/5 is twice as many as 2/5. We're folding that space in half. And then, now that I have my 5/5, I'll go ahead and give those some lines to make them easier to see. Now I want to propagate those 5/5 across the entire paper. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use them as a reference while I fold the next set of folds. So you can math this out, or you can say, well, if I bring the center line all the way to the edge, that is 5/5 up. So this line is 5/5 up from this line. And each time we move down one line in the fold, we need to move down 2 lines in the reference. So if this is 5/5 up, then I'm going 2 from that top line. So 2 down, putting in my new fold. And that is the rule that I use to get the rest of the way across. Each time I'm moving this mountain fold edge 2 spaces down. So I had 2 up here. Now I'm aiming for 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces above. Which we can also look and see, hey, that's 1 space above the old fold. So my next one is going to be to 1 space below the old fold. And then to 1, 2, 3 spaces below the old fold, which happens to be exactly to that line that we just folded. I want to go 2 spaces lower, I'm folding that center line to itself. So I'm going to jump down to the next set or the next mountain fold from that old set of divisions. And there I can use the same exact logic to get the 4 lines in between here as I did for these 4. Namely, if I brought this all the way up to this old division, it would fold on the center line. I'm going to come 2 lower than that. And then 2 lower than that. And 2 lower than that. And 2 lower than that for my final division in between those 2 old grid lines. And then likewise on the bottom, I'm going to fold up to 2 spaces below the old grid line up here, up above that previous set of new divisions, and then 2 below that, which is also 1 above the next old division, and 2 below that, which is 1 below the next old division, and 2 below that, which is to the fold that I just made. And that's exactly how I'm going to do it in the other directions as well. I'll set up an initial set of folds between old divisions and then propagate it across the rest of the grid. And that propagation of like, okay, here's my first one, which is 2 new spaces below the old grid line, and then 2 below that, 2 below that, 2 below that, 2 below that. That applies to any odd division. We use it in thirds too, but since it's only 2 folds, it's easier to memorize another way. But it's real obvious when you try to do sevenths, for example, because, yeah, the things are wild. So what I typically do for the next set of divisions, so the next direction, I typically want to try and place those new divisions. Actually, I'll typically place them in the first, between the first pair of grid lines below the center. Again, doesn't really matter how many divisions I'm going for, whether this is 5 or 3 or 12, or sorry, 7 or whatever. I'll typically go for these. And in this situation, I actually have a lot of grid intersections along my grid lines. So I have references, so I can say, hey, I want to bring this line up so that it's 2 new divisions below this line. Well, here's my, actually I'm gonna draw the line and then the new divisions as they cross, and also this line and new divisions as they cross. And 2 points make a line. So, and I also have those references over here. So I can say, hey, I'm bringing this edge up. I want to be 2 divisions below this next line up top, because if I just fold this line to that 2 old divisions away, I would just land on the center division. I want to be 2 spaces below. So I can line it up, 2 spaces below. I have 3 points of reference that are also specific points on my top layer. And I also have all of these grid lines that are passing through that are lined up from one side to the other. And then I'm bringing it back 2 spaces. I've got all of these reference points here, here, and here. These are on a grid line passing through there. And this is where if I wanted to catch myself, like let's say I was doing something, putting something where it shouldn't be, I would be lining things up and nothing on the top layer would line up with the bottom. That's a red flag. But if I'm lining it up appropriately, then things are going to match. And from there, I can line up to folds that I've already put in this direction. So I'm always paying attention to how the folds on the top flap and the bottom flap line up. And that is, and because I have like in direction 1, it will not line up. In direction 2, it will line up this way. In direction 3, it will line up perfectly. Because I have that in my brain, when I'm making the folds, if I don't see that alignment, it's a red flag, big alarm, like, oh, I'm not lined up right. And so then I can propagate further on. Okay, so I believe that was all the questions that I had accumulated in advance. Are there any more questions in the chat? And if not, we can go ahead and end the stream. In the meantime, I'll continue folding these fifths. And actually bringing it back to sizes of grid. This paper has 5 inches per edge. These 20 divisions are about the size of my pinky, so it's a pretty good size for a beginner folder. But for me, I'm going to eventually double the number of divisions on here to 40 and use that to fold another pattern that has been languishing, waiting for me to fold it for most of them. Well, I'm getting caught up, so they're not more than a year old anymore. But it's kind of a close call for some of them. All right. So earlier I'm seeing a thumbs up. I take it that means that your questions were answered. And there's something a little bit addictive about folding grids, honestly. As in, when I'm in the middle of folding a grid, I don't want to put it down. Which I know is not the case for everybody. Oh, and with these odd division grids, when it's really curling up, I often put something a little heavy on one end to keep that curl at bay so I can actually see what I'm working on. Usually that's a bone folder, but it's annoying to pick it up and put it down all the time. So whatever miscellaneous object you have around also works. Okay. So that is our gridding support section. Excuse me. And I hope y'all all have a great time gridding. Try out these techniques, particularly those imperfect hexagons seemed to be a common problem. And we shall see what you're able to fold with these grids now that you're getting them more perfectly folded. And actually, on that note, I do have some things to share that get around some of these problems, namely the printed crease patterns for Advent of Tess this year, which is still available on my store until they run out, and then I won't make more, but there's a couple dozen left. You've got a bit of time. Well, good. I'm glad it was useful for you. So with these guys, actually, these are actually a really good example of how to fold a grid that isn't quite perfectly aligned with the edges, because one of the things about the printing process is it's not actually as precise as folding. And so you get some lines coming not quite to the edge of the paper. So for these guys, I'd recommend, and it's convenient that they're on a light color of paper, because you can see through, and make sure that the grid lines are aligned on either side. So for these, I'd actually recommend going through and folding all of the folds in one direction. Weird, I know. Before folding the grid lines in another direction, because it's going to make it an easier process. Like, you don't have to think about, oh, how many am I skipping? Is it still lined up? No, just go ahead and do all of them in one direction and then the next. Yeah. Earlier, I think part of what makes it hard for me to stop gridding once I've started is because I already have a plan of what pattern I'm going to fold using that grid. And so any interruption to the gridding is also a delay in me getting to see what that pattern looks like when it's folded for the first time. So with these, you want to be working your way all the way across in one direction, then all the way across in the next and the next, using the transparency of the paper to line up the grid lines that are printed on one flap with the grid lines printed on the other. You can see if you're slightly off, you can tell that with the transparency of the paper. Okay, so that's one option. And then there's also these papers where the sixths, so the first odd division for folding 24 have been pressed into the paper. And these you're going to, on screen, you're going to fold up, again, making sure that the grid lines on the top flap and the bottom flap are lined up before folding all the way through. But this is an easier process than it would be on a blank sheet of paper. Yeah, Chris, that's another great way to fold grids if you're folding a lot of the same kind of grid. And then there's these hexagons already cut out in two different colors, the white and the cream, that you can also get, and these are machine cut imperfect hexagons. I've been folding with them for a bit, and they are in fact perfect hexagons. So that's another way around the imperfect hexagons problem. These are the 5-inch per edge hexagons that I'd recommend for the 24 division grids for Advent of Tess. So all of those options can be found at gatheringfolds.com, and also rectangles of skytone and acrylic hexagon templates, and some other tools for folding. So I encourage you to check all of those out, and happy gridding, happy folding tessellations. So this is the last live stream for a bit because Advent of Tess is going to take all my time for December. And then I'll be back at some point in January. I'll probably take a week or two off with some more live streams. And if you have topic suggestions, I'm happy to hear them. And I'll see you